Bismillah wa salatu wa salam ala Rasulullah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Welcome all to this second installment of a series of events that we're having here at the Lewisham Islamic Center as part of Islamophobia Awareness Month. Today's topic is the topic of the war on terror. Now, in the wake of the attacks on the World Trade Center on the 11th of September 2001, the American president of the time, George W. Bush, called for a global war on terror, which he said would start with Al-Qaeda, but it wouldn't end there. When announcing the war on terror, Bush famously said to the international community that you were either with us or against us. But there was also something else that he mentioned that was more problematic and perhaps shaped the narrative of this ill-fated war on terror. And that was that they say that sometimes something said where there's a slip of a tongue or said in jest shows an element of truth. And this is what we see here with the comment that was made by George Bush when he said that this war on terrorism, this crusade will go on for a while. And Bush was right, because the war on terror is still continuing up to today, nearly 20 years on. And Bush was also right when he said that this crusade, because the arena for this war on terror has been the Muslim world. With us today are, to discuss this issue of the war on terror, we have with us two individuals whose very organization, CAGE, was born out of the whole war on terror itself. They are both Ustadh Azad Ali and Dr. Asim Qureshi. For those that aren't aware, CAGE is an advocacy group who assist those that have been impacted on by the war on terror. Both individuals within the Muslim community, I would like to think, are household names, and from that perspective, I would think most people know them, but for the sake of completeness, I will introduce both of our guests. Azad Ali is an activist who has been involved in a number of different organizations over the years. He was involved formerly with the Islamic Forum Europe, IFE. He was the founding chair of the Muslim Safety Forum and vice chair of United Against Fascism. He's former director of engagement at the well-known MEND group, and he worked as a civil servant, and he's now the community relations officer or director at CAGE. We also have with us Dr. Asim Qureshi. Asim Qureshi graduated in law, specialized in international law and Islamic law. He completed his PhD in international conflict. He's the research director at the advocacy group CAGE, has specialized in investigating the impact on the counterterrorism practices worldwide, and he's been assisting legal teams involved in defending those involved in the terrorism trials in the US and at Guantanamo Bay. He's also an author of a number of books over the years, the first of which was called The Rules of the Game, Detention, Deportation, Disappearance, which was published in 2009. Most recently, he published a book, which was The Virtue of Disobedience in 2019, and is just about to launch, if not, may have already launched, I may be wrong there, the book, which is called I Refuse to Condemn, which we'll discuss later today. So those are our guests. We'll begin the discussion with a series of questions that I'll put to both of our guests today, and we'll take it from there. So if I could begin by asking Brother Azad, if you could please inform us of the work of CAGE and what they do, what he does there, and why he decided to join.
Assalamu alaikum, alhamdulillah rabbil alameen, assalatu wassalamu ala Rasulul Kareem, amma ba'd. Jazakumullah khair, Brother Zillur, for inviting us, and to Lewisham Islamic Center for hosting this important discussion. As you said, this is November Islamophobia Awareness Month, and I think it is a subject that is really important that we understand, and understand actually the breadth of it and the spectrum. So just as a way of what CAGE is and what we do, you know, CAGE has been around since 2003, 2004. And as you said, one of the major impetus to start this off was to actually highlight perhaps one of the most visibly atrocious Islamophobic kind of policy, law, and act that took place, and that was the opening of the Gulag, Guantanamo Bay. As you said, Bush made a statement about you're either with us or against us, crusade. Another really important thing he said about this is that the people that we're going to put here are, they're not humans, that they do not actually deserve any rights. These are the worst of the worst. So a narrative, a framing was actually pitched against Muslims. And it's really important to remember that every single person that was held there were Muslims. And the simple reason they were being held there was because they're Muslims. So Cage came about to actually actually blow the lid and shine the lights on, actually, these are not the worst of the worst. These are innocent humans, innocent Muslims that have been incarcerated, that are being tortured. And, this is what's taking place openly in our day and age, as it were. So Cage came about to actually challenge this injustice. And the war on terror, I suppose, was the specific focus. In terms of our work, primarily what we're trying to do is empower our communities to actually challenge these injustices, in particular those that are coming through either via laws or policies, things like Prevent, things like Schedule 7 and others, and really inspire people to kind of build that change and bring that change. Our work, I suppose, can be broken into three key areas. The first of the work that we do, going back to its inception, is actually the survivors of the war on terror. There are, thousands of Muslims that have been impacted by this policy, by this crusade, as it were. And Cage, what it does is it offers help to those survivors in terms of either campaigns, in terms of casework, legal support, advice and guidance, and in essence, to try to at least bare minimum be a witness and write down what's taking place to them. And where we can is seek justice for them. So the heart of Cage's work is actually helping individuals that have been affected or impacted by the war on terror. The second element of our work is to actually counter the framings and narratives. So, we heard about the worst of the worst. We heard about the war on terror. And, if you actually think about Islamophobia, it's all about casting Muslims in a particular guise, in a particular frame. And one of the fundamental works that Cage does is actually debunk that. And I'm sure Asim will go into a lot more of that, much of the work that Asim is doing. And alhamdulillah, his new book, which is edited with a number of chapters that talks about, I refuse to condemn, the tropes that are used against Muslims, the Islamophobic tropes. So challenging the narrative is an important piece of work. So we are publishing reports and briefings, regularly producing articles, doing interviews and kind of broadcasting events and things like that, as it were. And the final area is actually building that grassroots resistance, as it were, to this Islamophobic narrative, to the war on terror, empowering Muslims via workshops and events, campaigns, and just kind of helping people understand there's a lot of Muslims out there. They recognize something is wrong, something is not right, but they're not really clued up on, okay, what do I do about it? How do I actually deal with it? So that's one of the things that we're trying to do with that. So in a nutshell, that's what Cage is about.
Okay.
And important to say, 100% Cage is funded by the community, and without the support of the community, we will not be able to do what we're doing.
Jazakallah khair for that. Having some technical difficulties on our end, so you'll have to just deal with the audio for now. Dr. Asim, if you could please, I think Azad has set out quite clearly what the remit of Cage is, the work that they're involved in. It would be useful for you to, because I understand you've been involved in Cage right from the beginning. If you could maybe briefly explain your role within Cage, what is it that you do, and your journey within Cage from where it was to where it is today.
Sure. Jazakumullah khair. Bismillah wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. It's a great honor always to be with the Lewisham community. You know, I think by now it's quite well known the amount of love and respect that I have for Imam Shakil, especially for you, Zulu. But for the community in general, it's a space that I've always felt extremely welcomed whenever I've had the opportunity to visit and to be invited there. So Jazakumullah khair to you all for always giving us so much support. So in terms of, I guess let me start with my personal journey maybe, and then talk about kind of the work with Cage. So the war on terror happens in the middle of my law degree, and seeing the images of the Americans bombing Afghanistan, and then later with people being hooded and detained in Guantanamo Bay, it really made me kind of reconsider a lot of my life choices about the decision that I had previously made to become a corporate lawyer, and then for me to shift then into thinking more about human rights, international law, trying to use the tools that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given me as part of my rizq to try and affect some change for Muslims elsewhere. And so I went into my master's specifically to study international law, to better acquaint myself with the way that this whole international legal order operates, the way in which rights are given and taken away from people, and is often the case, the hypocrisies that come with that. I think one of the key lessons that I learned about international law, having studied it, is what a hypocritical system it actually is, and how rights are for some people, but definitely not for others. So that's really where the motivation came from. And it was just this kind of providential irony, like, this qadr from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that while I was doing my my master's and I was studying these things and I was writing my dissertation on Guantanamo Bay, that I emailed this website, looked fantastic, called Cage Prisoners. That's what we were known as at the time. And I emailed them. I said, hey, look, really brilliant website. Maybe you could help me with some information for my research work. And they emailed me back and said, it's us, your friends from South London. You should be volunteering and getting involved in the organization. So that year that I was in my master's, alhamdulillah, I started volunteering, started writing pieces for what was then known as Cage Prisoners. Started doing a little bit of sort of activism here and there. And then out of my master's, I actually then joined and became the first employee of the organization. So I wasn't the founder, but I was the first person to be employed to do this work on a full-time basis. And this has been my work ever since. So alhamdulillah, what is that now? 15, 16 years, I've really just focused on studying and trying to understand the impact of counterterrorism legislation and policy. So that's involved traveling across the world, interviewing people who have been detained, arrested, tortured, having had their children taken away, people who have survived bombing attacks, the whole range of types of cases you could possibly imagine. I've encountered pretty much all of them, and in very, very different geographical settings. So, some years I was in Bosnia, others I was in Sweden, then I was in Kenya, and then Pakistan, and the list goes on and on. But it also taught me how the war on terror changed the world that we live in, and how it became so normal for states to use the excuse of terrorism to take rights away from Muslims in particular, and to harm them through different policies and legislation. And that's exactly what we ended up with. This really awful situation where people were being hurt and harmed all over the world. And that's the content that eventually went into my my PhD thesis. So alhamdulillah, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave me an opportunity to get a doctorate in this field, it's really what I focused on. And yeah, alhamdulillah, I managed to do some other writings along the way.
Jazakallah khair. And you touched on an important point, which is that the how 9/11 changed everything, certainly for Muslims. And for those of us that are old enough to remember, we often speak about how there was a life as it was pre 9/11 and life as it's been since 9/11. And that probably takes us on to the next point of discussion, which is what I wanted to ask, and again, both of you, which is, what is the relationship, if any, between the war on terror and Islamophobia? Perhaps, Azad, if you could begin, and then we could bring Asim into this.
Let me unmute myself. Still getting used to this whole doing everything online. Yeah, I think, you know, when we think about Islamophobia, most of us naturally think about actually physical individual harm that takes place, whether in the streets or somewhere. So, you know, a lot of issues are dealt with under like hate crime and things like that. But really, the nub of Islamophobia or any form of racism and hate is when it's actually structured and organized and done in a way that is kind of supported by the infrastructure of the state. And I think if you think about the war on terror, one of the interesting aspects of the war on terror is actually it's a full spectrum thing. So it's not something that just affects a particular person, particular type of people, or particular environment. It's actually something that permeates every aspect of your life, and in particular Muslims' life. So, you know, we see obviously the obvious impact of the war on terror, where there are actually wars and bombs being dropped or drone killings taking place. But we see also, you know, the Cold War is actually more kind of pernicious and something that really impacts us here at home. So things like, you know, policies like Prevent, Schedule 7. I mean, if you think about the number of people that get harassed through these policies, the number of Muslims that have been impacted, that have actually just been stopped dead in their tracks in challenging anything or raising awareness about anything that they have issues with. You know, so there is all of that. And then, you know, even down to family issues, you know, we've published reports where actually Prevent was used to actually remove children. Well, the attempt was made to remove children from families using secret evidence. So things that have come out from the kind of war on terror. So you have all of these things. And I think on a global level, this is all underpinned now with what's called countering violent extremism, or Prevent International, as we sometimes call it. But, you know, in every country, I mean, if you look at what's taking place in France in the last few weeks, there is nothing more obvious. The irony being that, you know, France in a presentation, I can't remember actually where the presentation was, at the UN or somewhere, the EU, I think, in the presentation used a Muslim woman in hijab. This is the same France that doesn't allow a Muslim woman to wear hijab in school. Okay, doesn't allow her to teach in school or go attend school as a pupil with a hijab. This is the same France that the politicians in the French Parliament walked out when a young French woman was there to talk about you know, hate crime and things like that. So this kind of impact, this kind of whitewashing or facilitating of Islamophobia by politicians, by states, by policy, by media and culture is something that, you know, not enough light is being shone on. And I think as a community, whilst it's important for us to deal with those individuals that are being affected on the streets perhaps, but we need to put our lion's share of effort into looking at these issues. And, you know, we can go into more, but I think perhaps Asim should come in, because in his book, he actually covers this quite well, in Virtue of Disobedience and also the new one.
Before Asim comes in, just wanted to touch on a couple of points that you mentioned. So you said about the war on terror and the policies that have been developed, the counter violent extremism or prevent policies here in the UK, how it's a full spectrum. It permeates every aspect or part of a Muslim's life. And I remember Cage had, in fact, produced a report some years ago called Cradle to the Grave, which essentially deals with that very point, where it looks at how it impacts the lives of Muslims right from birth to death, in fact. So it's a good point that you made there. And of course, you mentioned about, you know, this Cold War on Muslims, that there's the hot war going on, you could say, in the Muslim world. That's part of the war on terror in parts of the Muslim lands. But then you've got this Cold War, and you've got proponents of this theory, such as Douglas Murray, who famously said in 2006 in a speech that we need to make conditions for Muslims in Europe must be made harder across the board. So you know, we've got that, and perhaps we can touch on some of this a little later. But yeah, we could bring in Dr. Asim to also share his views as well.
Jazakallah khair. So often when I talk about the link between the war on terror and Islamophobia, I use a medical term, and I'll explain why, but I use the word pathology. So pathology is usually, you know, kind of finding a disease that's attached to the body. So what you do is you look for the disease somewhere in the physical presence of the body itself, right? And the reason why we say that Islamophobia is a pathology or pathologizes Muslims is because policymakers see the aspects of what makes us Muslim as the thing that is diseased, right? So whether it's our names, or it's the color of our skin, the size of our beards, the hijab that we wear, these are all superficial manifestations of being Muslim. And it's in these things that you'll find profiling policies coming about, right? So when they profile you at an airport and stop you, it's because superficially, on kind of on the face of it, they're making an assessment about your dangerousness. Now that dangerousness is tied to what? It's tied to our being, of who we are, of the fact that we physically exist in the way that we do, which is outside of what's known as the normative non-Muslim white male or female, right? So if you exist outside of that, and particularly if you're Muslim, then the chance of you being stopped at an airport under terrorism legislation increases significantly. And so we see that it's tied to our physical being. But the pathology goes further then through other types of policy, like Azad's already mentioned, PREVENT and CVE, where it's tied to our ideas and our belief system. So again, this is another form of pathology, because what they're now trying to do is they're trying to use these other markers that exist inside us. Now these are things that exist inside our hearts. They're things that we believe in, and use them as potential markers for our dangerousness. So what they say is that if you believe in X, Y, and Z, so if you believe in the concept of a Muslim political or Islamic political system, or if you believe in the concept of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's law being most high, if you believe in any of these things, right, then you are in a matrix, like in this matrix of threat, that we then have to assess as being potentially dangerous. So this is how Islamophobia connects to the war on terror, because they have told themselves a story about how we are dangerous. So that knowledge production that they make through the books that they write, through the speeches that they give in Parliament, through the media articles that are written about us, they all contribute to an understanding of why we are dangerous. And then that conversation about who we are and what we believe in translates into policy. And then that policy harms us further. So you see there's this kind of almost endless cycle of us being problematized for legislation to be brought in that makes us more of a problem. So the numbers of us who are convicted of kind of non-violent offenses increases, which means that there's more of a problem, which means more legislation is needed. So there's this endless cycle that takes place, and it's all based on this idea of Muslims being dangerous, which is of course Islamophobic in its very essence.
Jazakallah khair for that, Asim. You mentioned about the introduction of numerous legislation. I mean, just from the top of my head, I mean, I understand it's probably about 20 pieces of legislation we've had since 2001. Is that correct?
I'm not sure if it's as many as 20, but like at least every other year, we've pretty much had a piece of legislation. You know, sometimes there's kind of like additions to pre-existing pieces of legislation, rather than, say, for example, full acts of Parliament having been brought through. But I mean, it's still significant when you consider.
I think it's true to say every year there's been something that's been added, if not a new piece of legislation has taken place. Yeah. But one thing I wanted to add to the conversation is the role of because how is it that you can get away with demonizing a minority community so much? How what facilitates that? What allows society and especially powerful people in society to get away with things like that? And we really need to maybe expose that a little bit. And I think if you recall the Munich speech David Cameron gave about muscular liberalism, and for me this hits the nub, where he says basically, I can't remember word for word, but basically he was saying that we've been a tolerant society, saying to our citizens that as long as you obey the law, we're going to leave you alone. Okay, so this is like a direct kind of shift. And famously Tony Blair, where he says the rules of the game have changed, right? So this is like where you have politicians, people, not just ordinary politicians, actually prime ministers, leaders of your country, telling you actually just being a citizen is not good enough. There's something else you need to do. And this is what opened up to almost like engineering particular types of behavior. So the good Muslim, bad Muslim kind of dichotomy that's been created. What's a good Muslim? The one that isn't actually a Muslim. Okay, that's what a good Muslim is. And they will kind of because they have that power, they will kind of promote that type of Muslim, the Muslim that doesn't really have any connection to anything that is normative. And obviously worldwide, one of the things that they're trying to do is divide Muslims into nationalities. So, I'm sure, Asim, you remember this whole kind of attempt on manufacturing British Islam, and how actually some Muslims went behind it, that, yeah, we should have a British Islam. So let's have a French Islam, a British Islam, an American Islam. So all of these factors, I think, play, very important role in facilitating then the harm that comes along. Why is it? I mean, if you think about it, if when our prevent report, I mean, we looked at stats of around like 500,000 stats. Now, if in 500,000 stops that have been carried out against another minority in society, what would the reaction have been? Would we still be saying, look, there's no smoke without fire, and we need to do this, and it's not really that bad, and it's we're just trying to keep everyone safe. All of the arguments that are being used would not hold water. The efficacy of Schedule 7 it does not exist. The stats don't show it. The people who are pushing it don't agree to it. And the only reason powers want it is because institutions like the police and others, they thrive on maximum power. It's always a dragnet. They always want to use the widest power first and then maybe drill down. And even in our recent report, if you look at the number of convictions that have been made through all of these legislations, that is paltry, actually. And we actually have pre-existing laws, criminal law, that actually deals with it better. And actually, a lot of these people have been sentenced using our existing laws and not these new terrorism laws.
That's a point I was just going to touch on, actually, which is all these legislations that have been passed, have they served their purpose? Are they fit for purpose? And, as you've touched on, my understanding is the majority of those that have actually been charged or imprisoned under these terrorism legislations are for things such as downloading some material, or donating money and things such as that, whereas those are actually perpetrating acts which is referred to as terrorism or political motivated crime, whatever you want to call them. There's existing legislation in place or laws in place that are there to deal with those. And so is it a case that these laws are being passed to create this fear, this whipping up this hysteria that we've got a real issue here, a real concern, you know, that then permeates in being able to pass more policies, more legislation, and, you know, continues to otherize the Muslim community? Asim, perhaps you could comment.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if we could explicitly say that that is the intention of the legislation. What I think we can say is that it is nefarious that the actual acts of violence that take place, whether by Muslims, whether by kind of those on the far right who have kind of political agendas or racist agendas behind why they're carrying out these acts of violence, that those acts of violence are predominantly, and I'm talking about like in the high 90% here, prosecuted under pre-9/11 legislation, under legislation that has existed for a very, very long time, that is part of a very old tradition of due process in this country. What do we see terrorism laws predominantly being used for? We see them being used for what we call kind of pre-crime offenses. So crimes that have been created by the state that were not previously crimes, but that they now consider them to be crimes. So for example, having in your possession a terrorism publication, right? But even then, even with these crimes, the ways in which they impact different communities vastly differ, okay? And that's an important part of this as well, that we see excessive sentencing for Muslims when they are caught for these crimes, and in many cases they are arrested and they're not even charged, or they're charged and they're found not guilty. We find there is no balance whatsoever in the reporting or in the help that these people are given. Their lives are torn apart, and we're talking about into the thousands of Muslims. We are disproportionately targeted by this legislation, disproportionately targeted by raids, by arrests, by charges. And the number of actual convictions, even though we disagree with many of those convictions in the first place, because they're for non-violent offenses, they are still relatively low. And so what support is there for all of those people who have been falsely accused in the ways that they are? There is none. And they don't care about the trauma that leaves, the scars, the intense scars that it leaves in the community when they do it. When 60 officers raid a home and tell them, the media, that this is a terrorism raid. And so the whole neighborhood, the whole street knows that you were arrested for terrorism, that they're able to hold you up to 14 days without in pre-charge detention. You think you have a job on the other side of that? Of course you don't. You have no chance of putting your life together after these things. But there has never, ever been a long-term impact assessment by the government of these pieces of legislation and the long-term effects that they have on our communities. Quite frankly, I would suggest that they just don't care at all to do that. It does not cost them anything. In fact, if anything, I would suggest they win a great deal, especially in political campaigning, around the notion that they are tough on terrorists, that they're tough on immigrants, that they're tough on crimes, particularly when those crimes are committed by people of color.
So do we have a definition of terrorism, a legal definition of terrorism?
Yeah, we do. It's in the Terrorism Act 2000. It's a very, very wide and vague one. And it's funny that you asked that, because in 2006, one of our friends, mutual friends, Fahad Ansari, who's a who's a solicitor, both of us, we put together this Know Your Rights workshop where we broke down the definition of terrorism, and then we workshopped it to different Muslim communities around the country. Now there comes one section of the terrorism definition which talks about it being an act of terrorism to be involved in being involved in the overthrow of a foreign government. Okay, and so back in 2006, we kind of like jokingly put up the pictures of like a couple of different world leaders. And the two of the pictures that we had, one was Muammar Gaddafi and the other one was Bashar al-Assad. And we said, look, you know, imagine a situation where there's a popular revolution that's going to take place against like these two dictators, right? This legislation would criminalize support for the revolutionaries against these dictators. So, you know, obviously you never like to be proven right in the end, but, you know, unfortunately history is on our side on this one, that all of this legislation is very political. And especially with the Libya and the Syria example, you see this dissonance in the way that people traveling to the two countries took place. So people who were traveling to Libya are very open about their desire to go and take part in the revolution there, right? They weren't criminalized for it because foreign policy diktats at the time were very, very different. With Syria, the game changed completely. And of course, there's some very good reasons why later on it was important for that that focus to shift, right? Especially with the rise of ISIS and so on and so forth. But at the start, it was interesting to see what, you know, kind of, and think about why the government was treating these two conflicts very, very differently with one another. And of course, you know, there's a lot of literature being written about the geopolitics of it all and kind of resources and so on and so forth.
Okay. And tied in with legislation, of course, is policy. And of course, with that comes, we've got here in the UK as the prevent policy. Now, those that are proponents of prevent will say, well, you've got people that are committing certain crimes, committing acts of violence. And so you need policy in place in order to protect people. It's there for the benefit of the public at large. So it sounds like a noble thing. So what's the problem with that? Azad, if you could please come in on that.
Yeah, no, I think, I mean, Asim already mentioned it. I mean, it doesn't actually deal with violence. It actually deals with what's known as pre-crime, or actually just what people ideas are, what people's thoughts are, what people's feelings are about various things that's happening, whether domestically or internationally. And what it tries to do is engineer behavior that is conducive to the state. And I think this is really important to understand the relationship between the citizen and the state. What the prevent policy does is actually open up a Stasi kind of dictatorial role of the state, you know, where the state tells you, okay, this is what you should do, this is how you should behave, this is how you should think, this is your opinion on this, and you as the citizen don't have that right, which destroys the whole foundation of this country, you know, and the history of this country. And I think a lot of people are starting to wake up to that now. In the early days, you know, it was sold as with anything. It's always sold sugar-coated. Look, you know, we need to stop these acts of violence that are taking place. It's really important. Who's going to refuse that? You know, of course, nobody wants any violence to take place. But when you actually want to talk about the actual violence itself, you find that the state doesn't allow it. I mean, why, for example, would a marker for someone who is potentially problematic be if they talk about foreign policy or the foreign role of the UK's foreign policy? You know, why is that a no-go area? You know, you will see that, you know, many people who push this policy, they will have this as a marker. Now, why shouldn't I, as a citizen of my country, have a view on how my country behaves internationally? Or how I want it to behave internationally. That's at the end of the day my right as a citizen. But this is what's been taken away. So I think first thing to understand is prevent is nothing to do with actually dealing with violence. It has absolutely no connection to that. It is solely about engineering behavior and kind of obedience, if you like, or compliance to what the state determines as conducive or is happy with. And
Zulu, let me just jump in on that a little bit, if you don't mind,
Sure.
for a second, because, you know, I think it's really important that, you know, we acknowledge how long Muslims have been in this country, and, you know, how well we've built relations with different communities for a very, very long period of time, organized alongside them. Sometimes there's been frictions, of course, as well, especially with minority communities, right? Like there's been a kind of a long tradition of kind of a shared experience of being otherized. You know, I do remember running down the street alongside my black friends being chased by members of the BNP during the 80s, right? So like, we've all had those experiences before. I think what the war on terror did, especially in terms of our beliefs, by going back to that word, pathologizing them, is that it tried to create fissures within different communities and exploit them in different ways. So, for example, on an issue like LGBTQ, you know, Muslims, generally speaking, had a kind of, you know, distant live and let live kind of approach to other communities, to say that, look, you know, we're fine teaching our children, our communities about their relationship to God, you know, how they understand their relationship to the world, to others around them, being respectful of other people, right? But what happened within the context of the war on terror is that that issue got taken as another pathologized marker of our belief system, right? So there was automatically this equating of, okay, if you do not subscribe to a certain understanding of the way that human beings should interact and relate to one another, then that is a signature marker of you being a potential extremist or going on to potentially becoming a future terrorist, right? Now, there is absolutely no indication whatsoever from any of our history, forget about just generally speaking, just in the UK, that was ever the case or that ever would be the case, right? But it just shows how the various aspects of, you know, who we are and how we're trying to understand ourselves living, you know, in this country as people who have been well established here for a very, very, very long time and living very amicably with many of our neighbors, right? How now that's being turned against us. How now our teachers and our doctors and our nurses are being told, look out for these signs, ask these types of questions so we can see whether or not these people fit into a predefined vision that we have of what the ideal citizen should look like. But of course, like, the ideal citizen is many things in many places at many times. It depends on who's in power. It depends on what agenda they have, and, you know, all the rest of it. So you can see the way in which we are being socially engineered and manufactured in order to become compliant in ways that the state can then manage and control. Okay, but of course, that kind of management and control inevitably results in repression, which results in more disenfranchisement. So it's actually the end game is nihilistic, because it doesn't achieve the very thing that they're claiming that it's supposed to achieve. Like, you know, the end result is usually the exact opposite of what they're claiming they're trying to achieve. And so that's why, like, even if you were just to take it from a completely kind of scientific perspective, what they're doing doesn't make any sense whatsoever.
You're saying, essentially, you're saying it's counterproductive. Now, but both of you have mentioned sort of aspects of these policies, the prevent policy, for example, and you've spoken about how it's there designed to engineer behavior. It's effectively targeting thought crime. But what both of you haven't done, perhaps it would be useful for the benefit of listeners, is to give some examples, real life examples of how these policies are actually impacted on the lives of Muslims.
Asim, do you want to go first, or?
Yeah, sure. I mean, this looks, you know, different depending on you know, what piece of legislation you've been affected by. You know, so if you're somebody who's had their citizenship taken away, then you could find yourself stranded in a country like Pakistan, in some cases, fourth generation British born Pakistani, being stranded in a country that has never been home for you. Like, home has always been London or Birmingham or Manchester or Bradford, you know, any of these places. That's home in your imagining of where you belong, right? And so that is stripped away from you because somebody decides that you have an ancestral right to citizenship elsewhere. And of course, all of this happens behind closed doors. So it's all under a secret evidence system. You can't see the evidence against you. And the government isn't obliged to provide that evidence. They can claim public interest immunity and say, you know, we're not going to disclose to the actual evidence. They can give you a gist of what their argument is against you, but they don't have to disclose why it is that they find you a problem. And it can literally, the letter that deprives you of your citizenship can say something as banal as you're not conducive to the public good. Like, what does that even mean? But it's not just citizenship deprivation. Imagine being in a similar circumstance in the High Court. And what are you arguing for? You're arguing for to have your children returned to you because they've been taken away by the state. And again, the letter that you'll get will just say that your children have been removed because we believe you to be an Islamist extremist, which again is not defined in law. This is a term that's defined in policy, and policy that was never ratified in Parliament, that's never had any scrutiny whatsoever. And yet they're taking the children of people away based on this kind of pseudo-scientific idea that they have about what care is. And so many of the judgments, after years of appeals, after the children have been damaged and harmed, judges finally accept, oh, we might have harmed the child by taking them away from the parent in this way.
I would thanks for those examples, but some people may say, Asim, some of the examples that you've given there, that okay, some of these individuals, not saying that they've done anything necessarily wrong, but some people say, well, look, there's no smoke without fire. Perhaps they may have done something wrong. Are there other examples, for example, children, innocent children directly being impacted by these policies? And if so, do you have any examples of those? Because of course, children are innocent. What crime can a child be committing in order to fall foul of these policies?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've seen it with Prevent, especially, you know, children being interrogated by counterterrorism officers in schools, doctors asking patients about whether or not, you know, they have an opinion on ISIS or, you know, or Syria or Israel, Palestine, or any number of things, right? And again, what is never, ever, ever discussed, what has never been done, is a long-term impact assessment on what this does to the child to have their beliefs questioned in this way. There's the wonderful organization Prevent Watch, who who's represented a case where a child was told to recite the Quran by counterterrorism police officers who then chose to try and school the child and the parents about what they felt the Quran really means. And they came up with this warped, bizarre interpretation that gave the worst possible meaning that it could of the Quran, right? So this is the kind of environment that we're in, where even our children are being affected and impacted, and we don't know what the long-term harm of this is going to be. I remember my wife once calling after an appointment at the optician, and she said, like, and my eldest son was 8 years old at the time. She said, for some reason, the optician started asking our 8-year-old whether or not he had a girlfriend, and she said, my mind immediately went to, is this due to Prevent training that he's asking this? So even if it's not, our relationship with those in positions of authority, especially within the public sector, has been so fundamentally changed by Prevent that normal kind of conversation, discourse, banter, whatever you want to call it, that might have existed once upon a time before all of this, it's now being removed. now you and the FOSIS have done some research, and NUS did some research as well around the ways in which Muslim students feel that they live in a climate of fear where they can't really speak about any issues, because they just feel like if we do, then we're going to get reported. And that's a very sad situation to be in. You know, like, I know I very much benefited from my schooling, from having an open environment, from being very open about my views, about having my views challenged and changed over the years. But this generation don't have that anymore. They can't afford that because they're worried about the consequences of it on their lives.
So it seems right to say that Islamophobia effectively has been institutionalized here in the UK under the guise of national security. Would that be fair to say, Azad?
Yeah, no, I think, look, I mean, one thing I just want to touch before I answer this is that, you know, you said there's no smoke without a fire. Now, it's okay to have a thought like that, but to establish if there was a fire, there needs to be due process. And this is the point where the policies, in particular the terrorism laws, and perhaps most importantly, the use of secret evidence and everything else totally destroys this notion of due process. Okay, so me as a citizen, you know, if my freedom is going to be taken away, or is going to be interrupted, should we say, by the state, then, you know, I have the right to know what have I done wrong, who's accused me, and I need to have my day in court in front of my peers where I can defend myself. Now, that ability has been taken away. That ability to actually defend yourself, to establish it actually if there is a fire or not, or is this just, you know, a smoke that's been created by some other sources. So I think it's really important for us to, as a community, not to fall for this, because this is like something that will allow the Islamophobia to actually continue. If we allow the state to get away with simple things like, you know, there's no smoke without fire, and then we turn a blind eye. No. Okay, you're saying there's no smoke without fire. Now go through the due process. Is that due process there? Does it exist? Let's actually do that. So this is really important.
That's an excellent point that you touch on, because some of the things that you often hear from politicians here in the West, be it here in the UK or America, is that the difference between us, i.e. them, and them, they, in other words, Muslims, is that, or those that they deem to be terrorists, is that they say they've got freedom, they've got the rule of law, a due process in place. But unfortunately, what we're seeing here, and what you're saying here effectively, is that when we as Muslims are saying, well, very well, we're actually trying to uphold these principles of the rule of law, due process. In doing so, it's then turned on us, it's turned on those that are trying to uphold those principles as being apologists for those alleged terrorists.
Yeah, look, you know, the state does not like to be called out. You know, no politician likes to be called out, you know, to be, you know, to have the mirror held up to their face. You know, when they see their face, you know, it scares them, because it's, you know, completely the opposite to what they're trying to project. You know, they're people like, for example, Tony Blair, you know, would like to project an image of a world ambassador, someone who's gone around and helping the world, you know, but this man is actually a war criminal. So when you hold that mirror up in front of him and he sees the millions of people that have been affected by it, the thousands and thousands of people that have been killed, you know, and you know, horrendous amount of lives that have been lost. When he sees that, he can't take it. So you know, there needs to be a resistance, there needs to be a reaction. And that reaction is to actually blame the person that's holding the mirror up. You know, that's what it is. So this is really important for us to understand that, you know, whilst, you know, we like to project, you know, look, one of the definitions they use for extremism, what's the term? Public British. What's the term? I forgot the term. What's the term they use for extremism? That's I don't know. I can't remember. It's gone. But one of the descriptions is democracy. Okay, so that, you know, you someone that is against democracy is seen as an extremist. Okay, If you now hold up the mirror to this country and how many dictators is supporting, how many wars is funding via dictators, isn't it not an extremist state by its own definition? Now, of course, when you hold that mirror up to it, it doesn't like it. It does not like it. So that's why it can't win the argument. So what it does is it takes out the player. You know, the football analogy. Instead of going for the ball, go for the player. Something that Lewisham Islamic Center won't know anything about. I had to throw that in because Imam Shakil might be listening. Yeah.
On that note, I think once lockdown's over, inshallah, I think you've just challenged us to a game of football.
Inshallah.
Cage versus Lewisham Islamic Center.
That's live. Everyone's listening to that, inshallah. You can't back down from that.
I look forward to it.
We'll succeed in that, inshallah. Moving on briefly, Asim, I know in some of your books and some of your written work, you've drawn on historical analogies with the experience of other communities at other points in history where a similar war on terror or oppression was exacted on other communities. Can you briefly please elaborate on these? Because it will then enable or assist some of the listeners to be able to understand and contextualize exactly what's going on, what it is that we've been discussing over the last hour or so.
Yeah, Jazakumullah khair. So, yeah, my last book, A Virtue of Disobedience, really was about trying to do that. It was about trying to, reflect, do tadabbur on the Quran. It's not any attempt at tafsir. It's like me reflecting on the various stories that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us in the Quran and tries to understand how we might think of these within a modern context of the different types of oppression and repression that we face. And, of course, the Quran is always open to that. I mean, there's a reason why a third of the Quran is a collection of stories. And those stories aren't there as simply a story time feel good factor. This is about lessons. The whole of the Quran is guidance. It's a book of guidance in our lives. And so we're supposed to take what we can from it in order to better understand the world. And if you understand that human behavior operates in cycles rather than as something that's just on a linear timeline, that there's nothing that ever looks similar or repeats itself. Human beings in that sense, we're quite obvious. We make the same mistakes over and over and over again because the world's oldest anthropologist, Iblis, has really studied us quite well and knows quite well how to mess with us. He knows what the weak points of the human condition really are. And so what we find is that we replicate oppression, especially from at a state level, in ways that are quite regular and quite obvious. And I think there are so many different elements that, I mean, I'm just trying to think right now in my mind about something that I could focus on. But if we just take Surah Ghafir, for example, as just one example of the many lessons that the Quran might give us, right? You have two men, ostensibly from different parts of society. One man, he's close to Fir'aun. He's within Fir'aun's council. He's close enough to advise Fir'aun when Fir'aun's making decisions about matters. And you've got another man who is from the oppressed community, Bani Israel. He's a member of Bani Israel. Interestingly, what Surah Ghafir teaches us is that it's the man who's close to Fir'aun that is a believer and who is promised success. And it's the man from the oppressed class of society, Qarun, who is damned to hellfire along with Fir'aun, right? So you have this really interesting juxtaposition in this one surah. And it teaches us so much about who we are and the roles that we play today, right? Why is Qarun, seemingly from the oppressed class of society, comes from people that are being harmed, their children are being killed, why is he singled out in this way? It's because, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, that Qarun oppressed his own people, right? He used his position as a minority to get close to power, and then used that position that was close to power in order to harm the others who were also oppressed. So, and what is it about the secret believer? That in the position of power and authority that he has, when the moment comes for him to speak truth, to defend Musa alayhi salam, to put himself at risk of Fir'aun's wrath, he takes that opportunity and he speaks those words of truth, which then of course we know that Abu Bakr radiallahu anh will repeat later, you know, would you kill a man for saying his Lord is Allah, right? And so, you know, we find these resonances. As Abu Bakr radiallahu anh found that resonance, we find these resonances as well throughout our lives. And that's why the Quran is so important for us. Not just the Quran, of course, but, you know, any book of history, really. You know, any book of history becomes an important thing for us to make tadabbur on. But of course, the Quran is divine guidance. You know, you literally cannot, you know, doubt the message within it. You cannot doubt the facts that we've been given. And so with yaqeen on those facts, we can then reflect on those facts and take lessons for them in our lives. So that was just one example, but the book is full of many other examples.
Jazakallah khair. There's another point I wanted, was hoping that you'd also touch on. I know, for example, when we look at history, we look at, for example, the Inquisition that took place in Spain in the 15th century by the Christian Catholic community against both Jews and the Muslims, who are obviously referred to as the Moors in that period. And of course, with the Holocaust in the 20th century, and what took place in places like Bosnia as well. And what is it that this process of dehumanization or this otherizing that takes place over a period of time, which, because you ask any human being, some of those things that have taken place to those communities, you know, everyone would be shocked at what took place. But
yeah,
what was it then that enabled the state to carry out those atrocious acts that took place, and it was considered to be acceptable, it was considered to be okay for them to do that, and people accepted sort of torturing people, killing people, committing genocide in that way?
So one thing we have to understand about committing mass slaughter, it's actually much harder to do than people realize, right? It's not linear at all. When you study the Holocaust, you'll see that there's actually a book that I finished recently. I can't remember the name off the top. Yeah, it's called Ordinary Men, which is about a police unit who are asked to commit various atrocities against the Jews during the Holocaust. But it's about how that narrative emerges, right? And let's go back to Fir'aun, right? In the Quran, Surah Qasas, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala teaches us that there is a predicate to, before Fir'aun kills the children, enslaves the women, right? There is something that he has to do beforehand. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, he says that Fir'aun split the society into parts and then oppressed Bani Israel, right? So the Quran itself gives us an indication of the method that Fir'aun used in order to achieve the goal of committing the genocide that he was attempting to commit this infanticide that eventually he would go on to commit, right? And the slavery. He had to demonize Bani Israel first. He had to separate them from the other parts of society. So he splits the society up into portions. And then only after that process is done is he able to oppress Bani Israel. And of course, we see that throughout history, when you mentioned the Spanish Inquisition, you have the converted Muslims into Christianity. They were known as the Moriscos. When you read the letters that Ferdinand and Isabella were sending to one another and to various Catholic cardinals, they were talking about things like the al-malfa, which was their word for the niqab, okay, as being a barrier to integration. Like literally, they are using this language in their discourse around how to effectively assimilate the previous Muslims into Christian culture and society, or to kind of eviscerate their old Muslim habits. And again, you see that later with many examples with Bosnia, again with the Holocaust of the Jews. There are so many examples of how that demonization takes place. Uthman Latif, he's got a really amazing set of reflections on Surah Al-Buruj, on this whole idea of the level of demonization that had gone into the killing of these people by the soldiers of the ditch, right? And he specifically focuses on this word qu'ud that's used in that surah. So when we're sitting like this, right, we're julus. That's normally how we would refer to like the act of sitting. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses the word for these soldiers who have constructed this pit and are watching this fire and watching human beings burnt alive in it as qu'ud. Why? Because qu'ud means sitting back, relaxing, watching in a leisurely way, right? So now the image of what's taking place is so much more graphic than the word sitting would otherwise indicate. And, it's so amazing how something you will read from contemporary history will bring those verses to light. Because I was reading Lawrence Rees's book on the Holocaust, and he gives an example of the Auschwitz-Birkenau camp. Okay, so this was the crematorium where they were burning people alive. And there is a Jewish man who's sweeping the crematorium. So he's sweeping the bones away, he's sweeping, all of the horrors that are happening. And he's saying to himself, I couldn't understand how, while this burning was taking place, that the SS soldiers would be sitting around listening to Mozart, enjoying themselves. And it immediately transported my mind to the same pit of fire, to the burning, to the sitting in a leisurely way. And it just brought home to me those ayat from Surah Al-Buruj in a way that up until that moment, like you read the Quran and you take these lessons, but you have no way of imagining them within like the contemporary world. And that moment in that text, it really just brought it alive in a way that I had never really considered. Sorry, I've taken a lot of time from this.
No, thank you for those reflections. And I know some people might say, oh, it's a remote thought to think that something like this could happen to Muslims in Europe, or be it the UK or any other part of Europe. But I think what it's worth remembering, of course, is that the last time genocide did take place on European shores was, of course, against a Muslim country, which was Bosnia. Where is genocide taking place today? Again, to against Muslims, whether that's in, let's say, in Burma, to the Muslims there, whether that's in with what China's doing with the Muslims in East Turkestan, the Uyghur community, whether that's in Yemen. And again, it's not always that those that are committing that genocide are from a non-Muslim community, because of course in Yemen it's not. It's Muslims that are also playing a part in this process as well. So no, thank you for your reflections on that. Moving on slightly in terms of definition of Islamophobia. Now we know here in the UK that the APPG brought together a definition of Islamophobia, which essentially focuses on race rather than faith. I mean, I'll read out the definition. It says, Islamophobia is rooted in racism and is a type of racism that targets expressions of Muslimness or perceived Muslimness. Do you think, Brother Azad, that this definition plays into the hands of those at the far right or Islamophobes?
I think, I mean, the definition, I mean, I'm not really that happy with that definition, to be mild about it, I suppose. It misses the point, I think.
It creates a new word, doesn't it, in the dictionary,
yeah.
Muslimness.
I mean, it creates more confusion than anything else. I mean, Muslimness and everything else. And I think that it's a definition that isn't really going to be helpful. So for me, there's two big issues. One is what you mentioned is trying to define Muslims within a framework of race, which is not it's not doable. It's literally wrong, because Muslims do not fit into a race, and we should not try to fit into a race, because we're from all different races, and alhamdulillah for that. So that's the first fundamental problem with it. The second one is it actually completely bypasses the role of structures in this, and it doesn't identify a way to deal with that. So when you have policies like, if you can imagine racism, there is anti-racist laws that have been passed many years ago. Okay, so it's on the statute book, but has racism gone from society? No, but it's harder for someone to be racist in society without facing any penalties. So if you're racist at workplace, you lose your work, and you can almost also get maybe a criminal offense for it. But because the definition didn't have anything to do with the structures, we had people like Lord Macpherson after the Lawrence inquiry say that the Met Police is institutionally racist. Okay, so you don't have anything that actually deals with the most harmful part of Islamophobia, or the most harmful part of racism. So I think this is for those two reasons, I don't find the definition useful, and I don't understand this concept of Muslimness as well.
I think I mean, you mentioned that it's problematic in trying to define Muslims as a race. I think probably those that wanted to do so did so because looking at the example of the Jewish community, of course, who are both considered to be both members of a religious faith as well as a race as well. So I think that's probably
but we're not the same. It can be argued academically strongly that the Jewish people are a Semitic people like Arabs, so that they can be defined as a race in that sense, if you like. And when the ruling was passed, in that court, it's in the 70s or 80s, I can't remember exactly, but when the judgment was passed, the judge actually made reference to what constitutes race, what kind of things. For Muslims, that's not possible. We're coming from all parts of the world. We're coming in.
One of the things that they looked at, because the same applies with the Sikh communities, if you can show that your common ancestry comes from a particular geographical location, for example.
Exactly.
The Sikh community, it's from the Punjab, for example. From the Jewish community, I think they'll say, from parts of the Middle East and so on. But of course, you mentioned about they considered to be Semitic people, but of course you could argue Palestinians are also Semitic as well. So just the point on that. I don't know, Asim, if you had any comments about the definition.
Yeah, I mean, I think definitions, you always have to be very, very careful with them in case they come back to bite you later. It's always a key concern of mine. I think definitions do have a role to play, but they have to be very carefully constructed. So, for example, could this definition of Islamophobia be used in a weaponized way on kind of Muslim divisions, right? So, for example, if you have a disagreement like we've been having for 1500 years with another sect of Islam, with another group who claim to be Muslim, and they say that, well, effectively you're being an Islamophobe against us, or you're discriminating against us because you don't accept our Muslimness, then that could potentially present a problem, because what it then also does is that it allows for the government to construct a notion of what Islam actually is by then using this definition to resolve these rivalries effectively. Okay. Now the thing is that intellectually we haven't resolved these different areas with like great ulama coming out from many, many different traditions, talking about these things, debating with one another. And to think that the UK government could come along in 2020 and say, well, we're going to resolve all of these differences for you through using a piece of legislation that was supposed to protect you is, you know, completely absurd. And of course, that speaks to the history of colonization, of the way that certain laws were brought in, like in India, well, you know, at least in the Pakistan side of it, where we have blasphemy laws. But those blasphemy laws are 99% used between different rival sects, so mostly between Deobandis and Brahmins, okay, who bring cases against one another for blasphemy, and we need to try and avoid that that potential for that violence of colonization and division to then appear on in the UK, right? We have to be aware of that. We have to understand that, you know, these things are a potential problem. And that's why I think, for me, I have, for many other reasons, which I won't go into right now, but I have reticence about this definition and how it could be used potentially to harm us as well.
Jazakallah khair. Now, we've seen, and we touched on earlier, that right from the very inception of this war on terror, language that was used by George Bush at the time, that you're either with us or you're against us, and it still rings true to this very day, because we know that, and we touched on it again, that those that are seeking to criticize the war on terror are automatically labeled as apologists for terror, apologists for terrorists, being on the other side. And we've seen that with Cage and a number of other Muslim organizations, of course. And there are even those in the Muslim community who would probably say that, you know, some of the things that Cage says, or the approach of Cage to some of these things, which is quite confrontational, in fact, has a negative impact on the Muslim community, or only further aggravates Islamophobia. What would you say to this, Azad?
I mean, bring the proof is the first thing I suppose I would say. I think, I mean, people like to make wild claims. I think anything we've been doing as an organization or as individuals has not brought on Islamophobia. All it's done is actually shone the light on Islamophobia. And you know, the public, in particular the Muslim community that weren't aware of it, are now seeing it. And I think this is always going to be the case. Look, you know, if we bury our heads in the sand and hope that everything's going to be okay, it's never going to be okay, and we know that. And you know, Asim's written a whole book on the virtue of disobedience just to bring out this point, because if you say you're a Muslim, then you cannot just sit by idly and allow injustices to go take place. You know, it is part of our religion. It is to do Amr bil Ma'ruf and Nahy Anil Munkar is a part of us. That's what we do. You know, it's just like the 5 daily prayers, like fasting and everything else. This is something that is a requirement. So that's generally. Now, if you yourself are being oppressed, if you yourself are being treated in an unjust way, being discriminated against, and yet you do not wish to speak up and challenge it, then that's a very kind of sorry state to be in, but it's not a state for a Muslim to be in at all. So I think we've got to be clear about that. In terms of, you know, making those people who challenge policies of the war on terror and everything else, throwing labels at them and everything else, this is a well-constructed form of Islamophobia. This is, you know, if you look at anti-Semitism, if you look at racism, you will find the same kind of tropes exist, you know, where, you know, like, for example, I mean, I'm sure Asim will go into a lot more detail. There's an expectation of those people that are being oppressed that, you know, you need to, hey, one of you lot misbehaved, all of you need to now condemn it, okay? All of you are responsible for it. And if you don't stop it, then we're going to punish all of you. This idea, this is like, you know, this is how colonialism used to work. Okay, but that's just one part of it. The other part of it is obviously we are not an inferior kind of group to the rest of society. Okay, we're equal. Okay, and this is the starting point for any Muslim, is that we are equal. So anyone who feels that by challenging the state, by challenging injustices, that we bring more harm to ourselves, is probably challenging it in the wrong way, I would say, and doesn't understand what challenging means.
Yeah, I mean, before I bring Dr. Asim on this, just a comment I remember seeing on Cage's social media page from an event that they held recently, and you had the lawyer David Gottlieb who made a comment, and he said, we need organizations like Cage who are not afraid to metaphorically put the legal system's feet to the fire and make us justify our actions, which I thought was a brilliant statement. But even when you look through history, for example, you've got groups, organizations that are willing to put their head above the parapet and to go against the grain, to speak against the dominant sort of narrative. They're considered to be troublemakers of that period. For example, the suffragettes, you've got the suffragettes, the women that are celebrated today. You've got loads of examples. Individuals like Nelson Mandela, for example, who were considered to be terrorists at some point and are celebrated today. In fact, you've got statues of Nelson Mandela near Parliament Square. And so I think, we shouldn't necessarily be too afraid or too concerned or worried about the labels that are attached to those that I would say bravely speak out against injustice and for justice, which brings me to my next point. Actually, I was going to ask Dr. Asim, because he deals with, in his book, A Virtue of Disobedience. And I just wanted to ask what you would say. Would you say speaking out against injustice, against government policy, harmful policy, is a prophetic methodology?
Yeah, I mean, I think speaking about out against whatever is most structurally kind of significant for any community at any given time, that is the pervasive problem that you have within that society, is part of the prophetic methodology. Of course, the emphasis was always on Tawheed, right? To guide and to instruct not just those in power, but kind of the general masses as well, towards the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? So whoever it is, you find that there is a problem within that society that is taking place at a level that is profoundly obvious. I think what modernity has given us is a magnifying glass on every single one of those prophetic incidents, and said all of these are equal at the same time. So if you take Shuaib alayhi salam, for example, and the whole notion of dealing with the market in a just and fair way, we live in a neoliberal economic system which every single day oppresses people, through the fiat currency system. And so, if we're going to talk about what structurally the prophets were coming to change and advise against, right, that's huge. Like, we talk about liberalism a lot, and kind of the problem of liberal values and whatever, but how many of us actually have the thought that, well, is the money that I exchange on a daily basis even something that is acceptable to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? It's one thing that it has complete hegemony, right? Like, there's no way that you could imagine today or tomorrow changing the economic system of the world, right? But are we even having that thought that this is a problem, that like I'm trading on the basis of nothing? And so I think sometimes we because we see certain big problems right in front of us, we forget that there are a number of big problems that are happening and occurring at the same time. And one of those is the repression of the state. A huge part of that is racism. A huge part of that is the war on terror. But these are all manifestations of larger problems that exist in society, right? That are based around the economic system. It's based around class. It's based around race. It's based around power and cronyism and all of these things. They are all a mashup. So if anything, when we read the Quran, we should be reading every single prophet's difficulty and saying, oh my God, like I got to deal with that and that and that and that, you know, whereas maybe they were brought to change like one specific characteristic of something that they thought was problematic, which of course puts an even bigger burden on us, that we see all of this evil. And especially for those of us who live in the Western world, who have been given access to so much more than our brothers and sisters in different parts of the Muslim world, right? That what is that obligation on us in terms of the risk that we have, in terms of what we're able to study, in terms of the resources that we have, in terms of our ability to write and read and think and post, you know, even like the whole idea of not, you know, having to think too much, although it might be a bad thing sometimes, right? Before you send out a tweet is a huge deal. And we don't pay enough attention to, right? And I'm not saying here, oh, like this whole idea of like the UK is so much better to live than anywhere else. It might well be, okay? It doesn't mean that the repression that Muslims face here is okay, right? We don't do that kind of like thing. Everyone acts and according to their specific situation, right? And part of our situation, part of our test is in our ease and how we internalize that ease when we're trying to take these things to account. So, you know, part of the message of the book is you know, we have to think deeply about the risk that we've been given and the role that we have to play for the ummah based on that risk. Just by virtue of the passport, the British passport that you have, your risk places you in like the top percents of the world in terms of your ability to travel, your ability to mobilize, to move, and so on and so forth. And it's not something that we should take for granted.
Indeed, in fact, we've seen though some Muslims that have that privilege of the British passport because of the maybe the fact that they are from because of their ethnicities, that they've had that privilege removed. We've seen that with some examples in recent years as well. So in terms of the war and the war on terror and how it's developed, these Islamophobic narratives that we've looked at and touched on today, such as the dichotomy of the good Muslim versus the bad Muslim, those that feel compelled to condemn and those who choose not to condemn. And with that in mind, again, Dr. Asim, perhaps it would be a useful point to bring and discuss your the new book that's been published, which you know, I've had the privilege of reading some segments of it. It looks like an excellent, fantastic read, called, of course, I Refuse to Condemn. If you could speak to us about the
Sure. Sorry.
What the purpose of the book is, and what it is that you're dealing with in the book, or what the writers are dealing with.
Sure. So it's an edited collection, which means that I brought together 16 different contributors to talk about their experiences of being asked to condemn. And it's not just Muslims. We've got some non-Muslims in there as well, and people from different backgrounds. So there's a range of voices, and the focus is on this idea that in whatever space you're in as a minority, you are asked to condemn the violence of those who you are not responsible for. Okay, so with Black people, you'll often find that they're asked to condemn things like drill music or so-called gang-related violence. And the question, I guess, for the book was, okay, well, what do our experiences look like? But also at the same time, how do we resist them? This book, to make it very clear, and I state this in my introduction, was not written to convince people that we shouldn't condemn. This book has been written to explain to our own communities what the different nuances and experiences are of how we're being asked to condemn all the time, but also to show through my picking certain activists how we can also resist that. Okay, so it's a very, very specific focus, which is just on this one particular issue, right? But inshallah, it's also a pathway for others to feel some confidence that, oh, right, so if I don't play by the rules, I can still survive, I can still contribute, I can still have a career, can still contribute and be respected, and live a very, very fulfilled life, right? Sometimes the fear of what the state might do to us, or what teachers might do to us, or what others might do to us, kind of becomes very, very inhibiting in terms of us expressing ourselves as we should. And inshallah, what I hope, because all the people that contribute to this this collection have shown a great deal of courage at various moments to resist this desire to try and explain ourselves, to explain our lives, to say, look, I'm okay, I'm one of the good ones, right? Don't blame me, I'm sorry about what those others are doing. And rather just to say, look, I hold no obligation or duty to apologize on the behalf of somebody else. Like, I'm just as susceptible at being harmed as much as anyone else is from a whole range of violence. Why are you placing certain types of violence above others, right? So it's not really trying to explain our case, as it were. It's more about us having an internal conversation between one another about what these moments mean and why they might be harmful. The one essay, which is the first essay after my introduction by Shinaz Banglawala, it's the only one that's data driven. And even with that essay, what Shinaz is showing, she's not trying to prove our case. What she's showing through certain studies that she was involved with, doing focus groups and conducting various pieces of research, was that ultimately it makes no difference whatsoever. When you do condemn, it has no bearing on anyone else, the people who are asking us to condemn, of raising their opinion of Muslims at all in any way. In fact, in some cases, people are like, yeah, damn right they should. Right?
Yeah, I mean, in the book, I read the introducing pages, and I remember seeing it starts off quite powerfully, actually, because you speak about your own experience in appearing on Channel 4 alongside Jon Snow, an interview that you were having with Jon Snow, and I think they were discussing the case of Jihadi John or Mohammed Emwazi. And I think just moments before, they even showed clips of his teacher, a former teacher, explaining what she considered, how she knew him at that point when he was young, to be a nice individual, or whatever it was, however she explained him. And of course, then you've got your own issue with that in terms of how you spoke about him at a certain point in time when you knew him as well. And then it was then put on you by Jon Snow, I believe, about whether you condemn, and that's how it all came about.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so ironic to see those moments. And Jon Snow is somebody that I think most of us regard in a very decent light. Somebody who's generally quite fair in his reporting on a number of issues. But yeah, it was a horrible moment. And I think one of the things that people don't realize, and it's the first time I've ever opened up about this publicly, is that it leaves a physiological scar on you to have those moments. You can read it more in the book without me going into detail about it now, inshallah. But it's hurtful, and it has ramifications on your life and your body and your mind to have these moments of constant, kind of demands that you condemn. Of course, it's even more ironic because a few months later, Jon Snow tweets about how nice a guy Tariq Aziz was, in Saddam's regime, and was roundly condemned by many people for showing him that support after Tariq Aziz died, and Jon Snow kind of like doubling down and saying, well, he was a really decent guy. So and even actually yesterday, Andrew Neil kind of complaining about being condemned or being asked to condemn climate skeptics because he didn't like Extinction Rebellion by Philip Schofield. So these people who constantly make these demands that those who look like me condemn, you know, when they're asked the same thing, they become livid over the demand that's being made of them, which kind of shows you a little bit about how you know, bigoted they are. You know, maybe invisibly, maybe they don't realize it, but they ultimately they are bigoted in terms of how they.
You mentioned Andrew Neil there, interestingly. Of course, us here in the Lewisham community don't think much of Andrew Neil for obvious reasons, of course. But what I will say is the BBC let Andrew Neil go, but alhamdulillah, Imam Shakil's still in post.
Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah. As are so many of these guys. You know.
Just Azad, if I could bring you on the issue about creating allies with other communities, other oppressed groups, for example, the Black community that have had experience in challenging oppressive government policy, or the Irish community, for example, as well. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I think as Asim mentions, I mean, we've got to learn from others' experiences, our own history, because, you know, it will help us deal with the situation in a much better way, but collectively it will make us stronger. And I think, you know, one of the things that you can learn from, say, like, you know, what the Holocaust or what's taken place in Bosnia, or, you know, you mentioned Spain and other places, is that, you know, the dehumanization. I mean, as Asim just mentioned now, you know, this asking for condemn, it might not be planned. It might be just something that's happening. I don't actually believe that. I actually think it is a policy, a deliberate policy by people in media or people that hold high offices to actually dehumanize and kind of disempower whichever minority they're doing it to. So in this case, Muslims. Because can you imagine what happens to you that, you know, you, like, you know, being a Muslim, you cannot have a thought about someone that you knew before they committed anything that was illegal, you know? So, but a non-Muslim person, when they say, oh, you know, when this person was young, they were a really nice person, no one's bats an eyelid. There's nothing. Why? Because they're not trying to associate what that person done 20 years later to them. However, they're trying to associate it with you. And that is very deliberate. And this is how a lot of the media, a lot of the policymakers, think tanks, and a lot of the politicians behave with Muslim communities. They always try to link a Muslim with the crimes of maybe another Muslim. But, you know, they try to basically treat us as a homogeneous block, and they will decide, and this is the important thing, they will decide which one is the acceptable Muslim and which one is not. So I think this is really deliberate. I don't think it happens by accident, and this is very deliberate. Some people fall into it by accident, maybe, but it is very deliberate. So when you build alliances and when you talk to other communities, you learn these things. You see how it happened to the Irish. You see how it happened to the Black community, you know. So what that does is gives you that extra learning, but also, you know, it gives you hope as well, because, you know, they survived it. And you know, you can see light at the end of the tunnel, because sometimes, like Asim says, you know, the actual impact of all of this is actually quite severe, is quite traumatic, and it can completely demoralize people. And we've seen a lot of our youngsters, you know, I see a lot of them, they do not talk about the issues they would normally talk about, or if they do, it's like, you know, it's very, you know, quietly done in coffee shops and things like that. Whereas normally they would just be talking openly about it. Why? Because they feel afraid that, you know, oh, if someone hears I've got an opinion on this, that, you know, that this is going to ruin my life. You know, the trauma is huge, you know, to the point, you know, where people are thinking, okay, who do I associate? You know, if I associate with this Muslim, I'm going to get labeled as well. So then, you know, see the dangers that it causes. So you can have all of this learning from other communities. And so I think building alliances And one important thing I would say about building an alliance is that it should be done on principles, okay, based on principles. You know, sometimes people build alliances just without any thought, and there needs to be a purpose of that alliance, because when we work with other communities, they're not going to have the same views as us on many things. But if we're working with them on, say, for example, racism or Islamophobia, like a hate crime or something like that, then we will have agreement on what that looks like and what it feels like, because it's happening to both of us, and how to deal with it. And I think this is really important, that people build alliances openly, transparently, both accepting and recognizing that we're different and we have different value sets as well. And if we can do that, then those alliances always remain strong and don't get kind of abused by, you know, media and other people.
Very, very well made points. Before I ask both of you to give us your final thoughts and reflections, just a few questions by some of the listeners online. One of those, it says, it's worrying that there are reports that some people caught up in police actions find it difficult to get legal representation because of intimidation of lawyers. Any comments on this? And I'm not sure if you've had any experiences of this or heard anything similar, either of you.
I didn't understand that. Intimidation of lawyers.
I mean, that's the, I'm not quite sure. So it just says,
the lawyers have been intimidated and they couldn't get help.
Intimidation of lawyers. Yeah, it's not quite clear, to be honest. I mean, I'm just reading word for word what appears online, but it may well be that what they're trying to say is perhaps there's a fear from some members, even in the legal community, to take on some of these cases. Have you found that?
I mean, I think lawyers are risk averse in the way that they take on cases and the way that they represent their clients, because they don't understand about how they can challenge the system, and so and also they don't understand the lives of their clients as well. It's a problem when you have particularly white middle class barristers representing, you know, people from underprivileged backgrounds, minority backgrounds, that they don't understand the lives and the needs of their clients. They don't understand their cultural kind of issues, and you know, even historically, they don't understand their trauma. They don't understand many aspects of their cases, and so that can lead to some lukewarm defending, for want of a better term. But I mean, you know, I don't see interference as such and directly taking place. It's not that something that I've
yeah, no, you're right. In fact, in many cases, we've seen some of the most those that advocate or have been supported or representing Muslims have been invariably from the non-Muslim community. For example, Gareth Pearce, who has represented numerous Muslims affected by on terror charges and things such as that. Azad, another question from one of the listeners that says that the government and the media, quite frankly, don't care about Islamophobia or the impact that it has on Muslims. In those circumstances, how can we as Muslims have the greater impact?
I think you're right. At the moment, there's no interest. And as you can see, largely the politics rules. You know, at the moment, the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism is used as a political tool and has been used to destroy Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party, completely decimated. So, oops, sorry, lost me there for a second. So I think, you know, that is going to be the case, and we have to redouble our effort to actually make them realize. Now, the way to do that is first and foremost for ourselves to understand what this is and what it looks like and how we wish to talk about it. Because there's nothing worse than having 15 people go up to one person and give 15 different ways of dealing with the issue. So as a community, we really need to understand. And alhamdulillah, I think, look, there was a lot of discussion and debate about what term do we use? Do we use anti-Muslim hatred, or do we use Islamophobia and everything else? And I think like the community has, overall kind of developed a consensus that Islamophobia is the term. And I think there is a lot of consensus within the community that it's not, it can't be framed within a race framework. It needs to be broadened out to be basically discrimination based on someone's religion, but essentially that's what it is. So there's these things that are happening now. That doesn't mean we shouldn't talk. So, for example, Lewisham Islamic Center is an institution that represents its musallis, but also the community in the wider sense. It has interactions with people that have some form of political office, whether they're councillors, whether they're mayor of your borough, or leader of the council, and you will have politicians. And you rightfully should ask, what is it that you're doing about this issue? What is it that you're doing? You're not doing anything, or if you are doing it, you're not doing enough, and you need to hold the fire to their feet, as it were. That's an example. But we as citizens, we need to do that as well. So I think this is an important way of keeping that idea of this issue alive. But ultimately, look, just to go back, there's one of the kind of definitions of Islamophobia is that it's an irrational fear of Islam. And usually a lot of hatred, most hatred is based on irrationality, meaning they don't really know the other person. And we've got a really uphill battle on this, because we have a huge media industry that is painting a picture of Muslims in a particular guise. So not only do we have to overcome this smearing that's taking place of Muslims and Islam, but we then have to reach out to people. So I think individually, Muslims actually being Muslims, being proud and happy and confident in their deen, in their appearance, and just normalizing that and interacting with people will break down so many barriers. So many stories I've heard, even today, this morning, I was reading a story on someone's Facebook page, actually, where the only thing they knew about Islam was through the interaction that they had with this guy that worked with them, was a Muslim. They weren't even friends, but from that person's interaction, they realized actually that, why they wear a hijab and why they need to pray, and all of, and how important these things are and everything else. So it gave them a very good impression, and they didn't fall into the bigoted views that are being peddled by newspapers and others. So I think, these are some of the things that maybe we can do.
Okay, thank you. Another question was that someone's asking that non-Muslims ask how they, as people from the outside, the community, can help eliminate Islamophobia, or I suppose work against it, or assist in trying to deal with this problem. Asim.
Sure, Jazakallah khair. I mean, of course, there's different ways that they can do that. I mean, the first thing is to acknowledge that it exists, to share as much material as they can to educate other people about it. These are all important things. For us to have a long-term approach to dealing with these types of discrimination, though, and it's not just against Muslims, right? Like other forms of discrimination against, say, for example, Black people, that have been systemic for a very long time. We have to develop an idea of who takes risks. And it's something that, again, I write about in Virtue of Disobedience. I posit this idea that the closer you are to the violence of the state, so the more likely it is that a policy or a piece of legislation will harm you, the less culpable you are, the less obligation there is on you to resist it, because you are most at risk of being affected by that policy or by that harm. The less likely you are to be affected by that policy, the more risks you should take in terms of challenging the system, including kind of sit-ins, including protests, including acts of civil disobedience, all within a legal structure, of course. But, the people who should be taking the risks really are those that are least likely to be harmed by the policies that we're trying to change. That's what real allyship looks like. Because otherwise what happens is that the burden is constantly placed on us, right? For a start to prove our case constantly that we are discriminated against, but then to also change a system that everyone else benefits from and has no stake in changing, right? That's the key here, that of course we have a stake in wanting to change the system because we're the ones who are most affected by it. But what a true, person with a true heart who's coming at this with the desire to help change an injustice, what they say, what they should be doing is taking those risks. And Martin Luther King called this out a very, very long time ago when he said that, the person that he had most disdain for was the moderate liberal. Because for him, the moderate liberal was constantly telling Black activists that your time will eventually come. Like, don't rock the boat too much. Don't, campaign too much. We can make these incremental changes, but they're not suffering at the harsh end of the violence of the state. And so for me, true allyship looks like risk taking, in the sense that, these people should be out in the streets. They should be trying harder than anybody else to make sure that the system changes, because otherwise all you're doing is just, trying to make yourself feel better about benefiting from a system that discriminates against others, which, really doesn't help us that much.
Thank you. Just the last two questions, and perhaps we could take these together. One is, if my child is being investigated by Prevent, what steps could I take to ensure the safety of my family through this process? And the second question, which I would say is linked, is if Prevent officers are hassling and bullying you, what steps can you take to protect yourself? Azad.
Yeah, no, in all cases, I would say, please do call our helpline. It's on our website. We will assist you all, because not every case is the same. But generally, what I would say, look, an intervention by Prevent or officers, whether it's in school to do with a child, or whether it's at home, anywhere else, it is regulated still nonetheless. It might be bad, but it's still regulated. So the first thing that we got to understand is that we should have our own confidence. We should be clear. We should ask questions. We should be clear that, okay, you want to speak to my child, or you want to talk about this. Okay, on what basis? Why are you coming? Show us, put it in black and white. Can you give it to me in black and white? You should take notes and you should ask questions. Not, you don't have to be, and you shouldn't be discourteous or anything else. Just say, okay, you can even offer them tea, but you need to say, why are you here? Okay, what prompted you to come to my child or ask these questions to my child? What is it? Where are you coming from? 9 times out of 10, what we find is when you actually ask these questions, they back off. Because one of the tactics of Prevent and people who push Prevent is to basically scare people into giving more than they need to, and kind of co-opting whatever that is being said. So I think, just act as a confident citizen, ask the right questions, and then contact us. And if you're not comfortable, just say, look, you know what, I'm not comfortable with this interview right at this moment. Give me the information and I will arrange another time. I want to get some advice. And that's it. And that's your right. You do have that right to get advice.
Thank you. Or they could contact Prevent Watch, which is another organisation dedicated to deal with prevent-related issues. And what I would obviously say is that no one should feel that they are that it's okay to be bullied. No one has the right to bully you. It doesn't matter in any aspects of your life. And as you mentioned, bullies tend to operate in the shadows, and so therefore it's important that we put the spotlight on them and draw them out and expose them. You know, no one should be subjected to that. Now, just some final words, and it's always worth ending on a positive note. Of course, away from this topic, a positive note, of course, is that the amount of injuries that Liverpool FC have at the moment, but apart from that, if we could end, I mean, lots of this, I mean, this topic, of course, you know, we covered a lot of issues that concern the Muslim community, most likely for ourselves, impact on our children. You know, I think the fear for you, as it is for me, is that we fear for our children and what it is that they're going to be exposed to and subjected to. So some positive reflections, please, from both of you, and either of you can start.
Yeah, okay, so I think, look, yeah, you're right. It is sometimes, you know, when you talk about all of these things, it might seem like, okay, it's very depressing out there, and you know, and feel kind of down and everything. We shouldn't. As Muslims, we know that's not how our state should be. We should be ever hopeful. You know, just in terms of advice, there's probably, I would say, 2 or 3 things I would advise. The first is, look, be confident in who you are, in your identity as a Muslim and in Islam, and embrace it fully. Don't let anything put doubts into that. And this is fundamental, because everything that we're facing, these are all trials and tests. And we know as Muslims, this is something that we're always going to face, and we have to overcome them in the best of ways. And that's the key. How do we challenge, how do we pass these trials and tribulations, whether it's from Schedule 7 or the state, or, you know, some other things, personal tragedies, whatever it is? How do we overcome them in the best ways, in the ways that will please Allah the most and will get us Jannah in the Akhirah? How can we do that? So I think this is the first thing. The second thing is, as a community, the more we come together, the more we're there for each other, the stronger we will become. It's not rocket science, but it is something we don't do enough. You know, some of the questions, or in the discussions, it came up that, you know, if you get arrested for terrorism, you know, you've got a bad name, and then, you know, people don't want to know you and things like that. We shouldn't be like this at all. Okay, we should be, you know, not listening to newspaper headlines. If, for example, you know, alhamdulillah, like Zilru said, Imam Shakil has still got his post, and Andrew Neil's been moved on by the BBC. When Muslims, whether they're imams or activists or whoever, are being attacked by mainstream media or anyone else, we should offer our support. We should be there and say, we're with you, don't worry about this and everything else. We should offer our support, because this is what's going to keep them strong and will help them through. So this form of unity, or togetherness, I think unity is probably the wrong word. This form of support for each other, I would say, is you know, like the feeling of ummah and everything else, is really, really important. And finally, I think, look, there's nothing in this world Allah has not given a solution for. There is no problem that we will face that Allah has not given a solution for. But it's down to us to actually find out what that solution is. And this is where we are a little bit lacking. I think sometimes, you know, we react without actually understanding and knowing. And so getting that knowledge base, understanding, the problem, what does it look like? Where is it coming from? What's actually the root of it? Using the right tools, you know, like, for example, we don't use the term terrorism. We use political violence or just violence. Why? Because we don't want to fit into the framing of the oppressor, and because we're challenging the oppressor. So these little things, knowledge and everything else, is really, really important. And I think, you know, we're doing quite a number of workshops on these. So if you're interested, do get in touch. But generally, stay Muslim, you know, support each other, and get that knowledge.
Jazakallah khair. Dr. Asim,
you.
Honestly, mashallah, Azad eloquently summarized everything that, you know, I would have hoped to say. You know, Jazakallah khair to him and to all of you. Really, it was a pleasure to be with you all today. Barakallah feekum.
Okay, no, Jazakallah khair. Thank you both for giving up your time. I know we said a sort of hour and a half, but the discussion was obviously good. I mean, we could have continued. It's always a pleasure to have you both. And yes, thanks for giving up your time, for spending with your families to spend with us and our community. If you was here in person, we'd like to give you a hug, but a fist pump would probably suffice here. Of course, you can't even see me because of our technical difficulties. So again, apologies from my end as well. And again, just on the note about positivity, of course, I would say, you know, I think Brother Azad's mentioned all the points really, but just to add really that, you know, this, I think the only thing I would say is that for Muslims to be Muslim and not to be afraid to be Muslim, you know, we need to have courage. You know, there's nothing more important for us, I feel, than what Azad mentioned about unity or brotherhood. And it's a marathon. It's not a sprint. You know, we shouldn't burn ourselves out. We need to have patience. We need to have sabr. We need to have that endurance, because for us, that race doesn't end until we reach akhirah and the afterlife, inshallah. And with that we'll draw to close today's event. We do have another 2 events coming up part of this month. Next week, inshallah, we have Tackling Islamophobia with Community Activism with Ghulam Haider from the Mirad Foundation and Imam Shakil Beg. And the following week, we have the impact of the media on the rise of Islamophobia. And we'll have Roshan Saleh from the editor of 5 Pillars, and Dr. Salman Butt, the editor of Islam 21C. Again, if you've got any queries, please do get in contact with us. Leave us a message or email or contact brothers at Cage. Thank you for listening and being with us. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.